The applause had not died after Harriet Denham was presented as Edmund Carlyle's wealthy bride-to-be when Edmund lifted a hand to the musicians and announced that he intended to marry another woman. The strings stopped. Harriet's fingers tightened around her dance card. A moment before, Edmund's initials had seemed to promise a future. Now they looked like marks left by a stranger. Her aunt drew breath beside her, no doubt, to smooth the horror for the room. Harriet nearly did the same. She had spent years making awkward people comfortable. Not tonight. Before pity could reach her, Harriet turned toward Geoffrey, Duke of Kellerton, at the head of the set. "Your Grace, I believe the hostess is owed one dance." Geoffrey left his place at once. He crossed the polished floor beneath 100 staring eyes and offered his gloved hand. Harriet stood between him and Edmund, exactly where every shocked face could see her choose. "One dance, Miss Denham," Geoffrey said. "After that, no one in this room chooses your place but you." She put her hand in his. The musicians began again. Harriet kept her steps exact. "He will say you planned this," Geoffrey murmured. "Then he may discover how little I value his imagination." She lifted her chin. "I will not be escorted from my aunt's house as though I have taken ill. I am not ill. I am merely no longer engaged." A laugh escaped him before he could polish it into courtly amusement. That helped more than sympathy would have done. When the set ended, Geoffrey bowed and escorted her only as far as the side gallery. I have 3 entertainments left before the Devon season ends," he said. "A supper concert, a theatrical, and the final ball. I require someone who understands a room before it becomes a catastrophe." Harriet looked at him. "You are offering me a fee to direct them, an honorarium for the season. Not wages handed across a table like a tradesman's bill. Your aunt may witness the arrangement, and my steward may enter it with the expenses of the 3 entertainments." His mouth tilted. "I pay for competent advice. I do not marry the advisor as part of the bargain." The ballroom had expected a proposal. Harriet preferred an offer she could consider without owing him her future. "I shall give you my terms in the morning," she said. Geoffrey's brows rose. "Your terms? You did say you required competence." His smile had no audience in it. "So I did." The next morning, Harriet sat at the breakfast table at Thorn Manor, with a fresh sheet of paper Millicent beside the window and Geoffrey opposite her. Before he finished his coffee, Harriet had already moved 3 guest cards on the supper list. "The widow cannot be placed beside the colonel," she said. Geoffrey glanced at the names. "He is deaf in his left ear, and she speaks softly. I thought they might ignore each other with unusual success. She is newly widowed. He asks every widow whether her jointure was properly settled." Geoffrey put down his cup. Harriet moved the colonel 2 places and gave the widow a quiet neighbor who preferred plants to pensions. Then she tapped the blank paper between them. "I will undertake the 3 evenings, Your Grace, with 3 conditions. I direct the guest flow and supper timing. You do not alter my seating without telling me. 1 evening in every week is mine with no duties attached to it, and you do not use my name to answer Mr. Carlyle's gossip unless we have first agreed what is to be said." Millicent's needle paused over her embroidery. "If Harriet is to perform labor your household would otherwise expect from a hostess," she said dryly, "it is better that the obligation be named than hidden beneath gratitude." Geoffrey inclined his head to her. "Precisely." Harriet looked back at him. "All 3 conditions. All 3. Write them plainly. My steward will enter the honorarium and the dates, and Mrs. Thorne may keep the copy if she pleases." "I do please," Millicent said. Harriet dipped her pen. Gratitude would have been easier. Terms felt better. By the 3rd day she had learned that Geoffrey's reputation for effortless social ease concealed an astonishing amount of work. He could enter a room laughing, and before crossing it know who wished to leave, who wished to quarrel, and who must not be allowed near the claret. Harriet read different signs. She noticed the lady rubbing one wrist after too much embroidery. The shy cousin stranded behind a louder family, the footman trying to carry a tray through a knot of guests who would not move. They did not compete over which kind of knowledge mattered. They began almost without discussion to divide the room between them. At the first supper concert, the Colonel discovered that his chair had moved away from the place he preferred. His mouth tightened. I distinctly recall being nearer the fire. Harriet was 3 yards away, speaking with the widow. She saw the Colonel turn toward them and knew the question he would ask before he opened his mouth. Geoffrey reached him first. "Colonel, you once told me, cavalry is useless without discipline," he said, dropping into a chair beside him. "I have been informed by a gentleman in the card-room that artillery has replaced the horse entirely. I thought you ought to hear the insult from me." The Colonel forgot the fire. Within half a minute he was cheerfully furious. Harriet did not have to move the widow again. She did not have to thank Geoffrey either. When she looked across the table, he was listening to the Colonel with an expression of grave interest, spoiled only by the amusement in his eyes. Later, while Harriet and the steward reviewed the wine brought up from the cellar, a footman passed her place at breakfast without setting down a plate. Her hand moved automatically toward the untouched toast at the far end of the table, not to take it, but to push it toward a young servant who had been sent in and out 3 times without eating. Geoffrey, still discussing a broken fence with the steward, slid a separate plate toward the servant and left Harriet's where it was. He said nothing about it. Harriet looked at the buttered toast in front of her. Then she ate it. "Which guest complains first tonight?" Geoffrey asked, still apparently concerned with fencing. The Colonel. Too obvious. "The dowager in lilac, then. She will say the violins are too near. The gentleman with the red face will object to the candles before she objects to the violins." Harriet considered. "1 shilling. Done." The dowager complained about the violins before the first piece was finished. Geoffrey paid the shilling after supper with such injured dignity that Harriet laughed aloud. The sound surprised her. Less than a week after Edmund's betrayal, another crowded room had given her laughter instead of pity. The weeks that followed did not become easy. They became busy, which Harriet preferred. On the afternoon before the theatrical, the house expected a delivery of ices and spun sugar ornaments from a confectioner in the nearest town. A cartwheel broke on the coastal road. By the time the surviving boxes reached Kellerton, the ices had softened into sweet water, and half the sugarwork had collapsed. The cook looked ready to resign from life as well as service. Harriet stood in the kitchen with a plain apron tied over her gown, studying the wreckage. "We have cream, yes, miss. Preserved cherries and apricots. Then the ices may become syllabub and fruit. Use the small glasses. Put them in the north cellar until the last possible moment." The cook stared at the number of glasses required. "It will take near an hour." Harriet turned. Geoffrey had appeared in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame. "Can you keep 80 people content in the card rooms for an hour without allowing them to discover they are waiting for pudding?" His smile brightened. "Can I tell them there is a wager involved? You may tell them anything that does not require me to repay it." Cruel terms. He stepped into the kitchen to retrieve the supper book from the work table, just as Harriet reached for it. The space between table and dresser was narrow. For one suspended second, his sleeve brushed the edge of her apron, and both of them stopped. It was scarcely a touch. Still, Harriet became aware of the warmth of him, of the flour dust on one cuff, of how easily his public ease could vanish when he was close enough not to perform. Geoffrey's hand remained on the far side of the book. "You first," he said, quieter than before. Harriet picked it up and held it out to him. Their fingers met briefly over the leather. "You have 80 hungry people upstairs," she said, "and you have become very stern. Go." His smile returned, but it was meant only for her. Then he went. By the time Harriet entered the card room, Geoffrey had invented a ridiculous guessing contest from titles pulled off the library shelves. He lost several small wagers with such cheer that no one noticed supper was late. When at last the syllabub appeared in chilled glasses, no one knew it was a rescue. The cook received the praise. Geoffrey did not correct them. Long after the guests had gone, Harriet returned to the kitchen for the supper book and found Geoffrey sitting on a wooden stool with a silver spoon and a mixing bowl. "You have stolen the remains," she said. "I have preserved them from waste. That bowl belongs to the kitchen. I am a duke. We occasionally seize bowls." Harriet leaned against the work table. "You also cheated at your book game." "I lost deliberately. Cheating suggests I intended to win." "You lost several pounds. One gentleman will repeat the story until Christmas. I consider it an investment in his happiness." He held out the spoon. Harriet took it and tasted the cold cream. Lemon sharper than she expected. "Vanilla would have been," she said. Geoffrey looked wounded. "I begin to suspect your judgment is not infallible." Their hands nearly met again when he reached for the spoon. This time Harriet did not pull hers away at once. The pause lasted no more than a breath, but Geoffrey noticed. His gaze dropped to her hand and returned to her face without a joke to cover it. Harriet surrendered the spoon. "Do not look so pleased," she said. "I have said nothing. That has never prevented you from being insufferable." They argued until the cook returned and demanded her bowl back. 2 days later, sea wind swept through the open terrace doors during rehearsal and toppled a tall floral arrangement. Petals and sugar shards scattered across the carpet. Harriet crouched beside the wreckage. The flowers were sound. Only the height was ruined. "Cut the stems," she told the gardener's boy. "Low bowls, rosemary between the roses, no sugar cages." Half an hour later, the gallery looked simpler, greener, and far less grand. A dowager arriving early surveyed the tables. "Very sparse Kellerton." "Is your gardener unwell?" Harriet kept her attention on the musicians' chairs. Geoffrey could answer this one. "Not at all," he said. "Miss Denham and I concluded that Devon ought to be permitted into a Devon room. It seemed discourteous to block the sea with confectionery." The dowager glanced toward the sea and nodded. "Quite right." She moved on. Geoffrey caught Harriet's eye and lifted one brow. Harriet smiled before she remembered she had meant to remain severe. The theatrical brought rain. 3 carriages reached the front court together. Wet cloaks and young gentlemen who preferred conversation to movement clogged the entrance, leaving an elderly peer stranded on the lower step. Harriet crossed the hall, opened the side gallery doors, and redirected the receiving line through the wider corridor. The elderly man gained a level path to a chair beside the fire. At the same moment, Geoffrey surveyed the young gentleman blocking the main door. "Gentlemen," he called, "the brandy in the billiards room is at present unguarded. I should hate to see the military discover it first." They laughed and vanished in the desired direction. Harriet looked at the cleared hall. He had not waited for instruction, neither had she. Harriet had mapped comfort. Geoffrey had mapped vanity and movement. Both routes had mattered. After the last carriage departed, Harriet began her old circuit supper room, gallery, musicians, alcove terrace doors. She checked a forgotten fan and one chair left in a servant's path. At the terrace, she stopped. The steward was walking away, his book closed. Geoffrey had already settled the remaining questions. A footman carried the last tray toward the kitchens. There was nothing left for Harriet to repair. Geoffrey sat on the low stone balustrade with a small plate in his hand. One lemon tart remained on it. Harriet could have found another task. Instead, she sat on the step below him. He offered the plate. She accepted it. For a time, they listened to the sea beyond the dark lawn. "It was a good evening," Harriet said. It was. No compliment followed, no attempt at a kiss. Geoffrey merely sat beside her after the house had ceased to require either of them. Harriet ate half the tart and gave him the plate back only because she was full. His smile at that small refusal pleased her far more than it should have done. By the 4th week, the whispers changed. At first, people had pitied Harriet. Now, Edmund's friends offered a neater story one, in which no man had behaved cruelly at all. Harriet had known of Edmund's new engagement and allowed the presentation, so Geoffrey's intervention would look dramatic. A wealthy woman, they said, had traded one prospective husband for a grander title. The tale reached Harriet through morning callers at Thorn Manor and through a note Millicent folded sharply enough to crease the paper twice. Harriet read it once. She had expected Edmund to excuse himself. She had not expected him to make her humiliation into evidence of calculation. Geoffrey heard the rumor as well. At a neighbor's assembly that evening, he approached Harriet just before the next set. "One dance?" he asked. The words were ordinary. Harriet looked at him, searching for the promise of the first night, and finding only familiar warmth. "One," she said. She gave him her hand. For the first few measures, nothing was wrong. Then Geoffrey turned his head toward a cluster of men near the edge of the floor. "Careful, Carlyle's friends are looking solemn," he said lightly, loud enough to travel. "Another, and someone may mistake them for men with consciences." Laughter broke from two couples nearby. Harriet's shoulders tightened. Geoffrey kept going. Another bright remark. Another glance meant for the watchers rather than for her. His attention passed over the room, collecting every stare and turning it toward them. He smiled down at Harriet with a devotion so exaggerated it could only be performance. The first dance had allowed her to choose where she stood. This one made her the object around which Geoffrey was winning a contest. Her dance card pressed against her palm. His initials occupied the line she had agreed to give him, but the room was reading far more into the ink than she had ever offered. When the music ended, whispers raced ahead of them. Harriet did what she always did when someone had hurt her, and other people might be inconvenienced by the fact. She found work. A glass stood too near the edge of the refreshment table. She moved it. An older lady needed a chair. Harriet found one. The next set was too quick for the elderly dancers. She spoke to the musicians. A nervous girl had been separated from her mother. Harriet guided her across the room. She could make the whole assembly comfortable if she moved fast enough. At the refreshment table, her hand closed around another glass. Geoffrey's hand came down beside hers, not over it, not trapping her, merely blocking the next task. "I am stopping," he said. Harriet looked up. His face had lost every trace of the expression he wore for a crowd. "I made you the entertainment," he said quietly. "You asked for a dance, not a defense. You did not shame me, because they looked." Harriet's voice remained low, but it cost her more than anger would have. "You shamed me, because you decided what they ought to see." Geoffrey stepped back. The space he gave her mattered. "I did." No just followed. Harriet took her dance card from her glove and folded it once along the center. "Tomorrow is the card party at Kellerton." "Yes." "Tomorrow I host nothing." "Nothing," he agreed. "I do not answer questions. I do not correct the supper. I do not come down because a chair is missing or someone dislikes the wine. You do not come down." Harriet held his gaze until she believed he understood. Her absence had to be allowed to exist. Then she went home with Millicent. The next evening, Harriet remained at Thorn Manor. At 7, Harriet nearly rose when a carriage sounded on the road. At 8, she imagined the card tables too close to the fire. At 9, she wondered whether supper had begun on time. Millicent turned a page of her novel. "If you ask me what is happening at Kellerton," she said, "I shall invent something dreadful." Harriet glanced across the room. "You would not. The blue room has collapsed. His Grace is serving cold mutton from the pianoforte." Harriet laughed despite herself and stayed seated. The following morning, Millicent returned with the truth. Kellerton had not collapsed. The blue room had run short of chairs, a carriage had arrived late, and a gentleman had made a painfully long toast. Geoffrey had fetched chairs from the library, rearranged a card table, and interrupted the toast with a joke at his own expense. He had not sent for Harriet. Relief came quietly. She could leave a room and it would remain standing. 2 nights later, Harriet went to Kellerton for the concert supper. She arrived after the first guests carrying no list in deep green silk instead of her practical working dress. She meant to remain only an hour. Geoffrey met her near the doorway. "You are late," he said. "I am a guest tonight. Guests are allowed to be fashionable." His eyes went over the green silk and returned to her face. "I have heard of this custom. I had not understood its advantages." She almost smiled. During the concert, 2 guests at the back disputed the last chair. Harriet saw it. Her body had already leaned forward before she stopped herself. She took a sip of wine. Across the room, Geoffrey caught her eye, grimaced, and offered the disputants his own chair. He stood against the wall for the remainder of the piece. Harriet did nothing. The music continued. Afterward, he found her in the gallery. "I preferred it when you solved the seating. You did adequately. I stood for 40 minutes. You possess 2 sound legs, an argument impossible to answer." Harriet turned fully toward him. "The first time we danced, you followed my lead. That is why I trusted you." The humor left his face. "The second time you forgot I was there." He did not interrupt. "I am still angry," she said. "I know. I do not want you to become dull because you are sorry." One corner of his mouth moved. "That is fortunate. Dullness would be a severe sacrifice. I want to see what you are when no room needs winning." He glanced toward the concert room, where a gentleman was already claiming Geoffrey's abandoned chair. "Apparently I am a man without furniture." Harriet laughed, but the laughter no longer hid anything. She had told him the truth first. 48 hours before the final ball, Edmund's story hardened from gossip into accusation. 2 callers arrived at Thorn Manor the same morning, each embarrassed to repeat what Edmund had said elsewhere. Harriet had known he meant to announce another engagement, and Geoffrey's intervention had been arranged in advance. By afternoon, 2 families sent regrets for the final ball. A third accepted with unusual speed. "They mean to watch," Millicent said, dryly. Later in Kellerton's morning room, Harriet held the amended guest list, while every old instinct returned. Move the seating. Improve the supper. Make the evening so comfortable that no one could look closely at her. Her hand reached toward the supper schedule. She stopped with her fingers an inch above it. That belonged to the steward until supper. She would not take Geoffrey's work back merely because fear made usefulness tempting. Geoffrey paced once from the hearth to the window. "I can end this before the first set," he said. His voice had gone colder than Harriet had ever heard it. "I will call Carlyle a liar before the room. He will not contradict me." "No." He turned. "If the Duke of Kellerton must tell everyone what happened to me," Harriet said, "then Edmund wins before he speaks. I become a woman whose truth is whatever the more powerful man declares it to be. He is destroying your name. He is trying to replace my memory with his convenience." Geoffrey's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Harriet spread a floor plan of the principal rooms across the table. She had used it for carriage flow and supper entrances earlier in the season. "I will control the room," she said. "You will control the exit." His brows lifted slightly. She pointed to the ballroom, the side gallery, and the supper corridor. On the first night, the musicians saw Edmund stop them. "Half the first set saw you at the head of the room. Everyone nearest me heard me ask you for the dance. Edmund's story depends upon blurring those moments together. And you mean not to let him. I mean to let people remember for themselves." Geoffrey looked down at the plan, then back at Harriet. "What do you require of me?" "Nothing until he has contradicted what the room already knows. After that you are host. You may show him the door. No declaration, no declaration, no gallant defense, especially no gallant defense." His mouth twitched, but he did not make the joke. Agreed. On the night of the final ball, Kellerton blazed with candles. Harriet wore gold. She stood at this entrance as the woman directing the evening. The side gallery remained open. Guests passed the musicians' alcove before entering the ballroom and later moved toward supper through the same corridor used on the first night. Harriet had not rebuilt her humiliation like a scene in a play. She had simply refused to let Edmund flatten a crowded room into a convenient lie. Those who had seen the musicians stop were near enough to remember it. Those who had watched Geoffrey leave the head of the set could see the same distance across the floor. Harriet had placed familiar guests near their usual pillars, not as witnesses on command, but because memory worked better when the room was not rearranged beyond recognition. Everything remained an entertainment. Nothing looked like a tribunal. Edmund arrived late. His expression was composed, almost injured, as though he had been wronged by the existence of witnesses. Harriet welcomed him with the same courtesy she had given everyone else. For half an hour he said nothing. Then, between sets, he raised his voice near the edge of the ballroom. "It is remarkable," he said to a small cluster, "how neatly some misfortunes improve a person's prospects." The conversation around him thinned. Harriet crossed the floor before Geoffrey moved. "Mr. Carlyle." Edmund turned. "Miss Denham, I understand you have been telling people that I knew of your new engagement before the night you announced it. I have only explained what others were too polite to say. Then perhaps you will explain one detail to me." A hush spread not because Geoffrey demanded it, but because people leaned closer. Harriet kept her tone even. "When you announced your new engagement, who ordered the musicians to stop?" Edmund frowned. "I did." "Yes." She glanced toward the alcove. 2 of the musicians from that night were present again. One lowered his bow. And where was his grace when the music stopped? Edmund's gaze shifted. At the head of the set, someone murmured from near the pillars. Another voice answered. "He was." Harriet did not look toward Geoffrey. She did not need to. Edmund's color rose. He moved quickly. "He moved after I spoke," Harriet said. "I asked him for the dance." The room heard me. He crossed from there to here afterward. She indicated the distance with one open hand, no more dramatic than when she had directed a carriage line. Edmund's mouth tightened. "If I had arranged your announcement and His Grace's intervention in advance," Harriet continued, "why would I leave him 30 feet away until after you had stopped the music? Why would I be the one required to ask? You wished it to appear spontaneous." A few people exchanged looks. Harriet almost pitied him then. Almost. "To make your story true." "Mr. Carlyle, I must have controlled your announcement, the musicians, His Grace's position, and the attention of half the county." Her voice softened. "You give me a great deal more power over you than I have ever claimed." A short laugh sounded somewhere behind Edmund. It was not Geoffrey's. Edmund flushed darker. Harriet held his gaze. "I arranged one thing that night. I arranged not to be pitied out of my own ballroom." There was nothing more she needed to say. She stepped back. Geoffrey moved only then. He did not touch Harriet. He did not stand possessively at her shoulder. He addressed Edmund as host, addressing a guest who had exhausted his welcome. "Carlyle," he said, "mild as cream, a man may misremember a dance. Misremembering where a duke stood in a room is an ambitious illness. The carriage court is this way. The line cut without becoming a threat." Edmund looked around for support, and found only faces suddenly fascinated by their gloves, their fans, and the candles. He bowed stiffly and left. Geoffrey watched the door close. Then he turned to the musicians. "Shall we rescue the evening from conversation?" The first violinist lifted his bow. The next dance began. Geoffrey did not ask Harriet for it. That mattered. Harriet returned only to the duties that were hers. She spoke with the steward about the redirected one, late arrival, and accepted a compliment on the low window arrangements without explaining the windstorm that had taught them the trick. The ballroom did not erupt into applause for Harriet. No one made a public declaration of her innocence. Something quieter happened instead. People behaved as though Edmund's story no longer deserved carrying. A mother who had hesitated over the invitation asked whether her daughter might attend the next music evening. One family that had nearly declined stayed through supper. The widow from the first concert pressed Harriet's hand before leaving. The county would still gossip tomorrow, but the story had changed shape while Harriet stood inside it, and she had changed it herself. Hours later, the last carriage rolled away. Harriet went upstairs, but found she could not sleep. The house held the strange silence that follows a great crowd. She returned to the ballroom. Most of the candles were already out. Geoffrey stood near the far wall with a silver snuffer, extinguishing a final unnecessary cluster. The servants had gone. He turned when he heard her slippers on the floor. For a moment, neither spoke. Harriet drew the folded dance card from her glove. Edmund's old initials remained beneath the crease. Geoffrey's second dance marked another line. Empty spaces followed both. She set the card on a side table. "The first dance was mine," she said. "I asked for it because I would not let pity remove me from the room." Geoffrey rested the snuffer on the table beside him. "Yes. The second was your mistake." "Yes. You tried to write my story for me." "I did. No defense, no charm to soften the answer." Harriet looked around the empty ballroom. Without the crowd, it seemed smaller. Only wood wax, fading flowers, and the faint salt smell slipping in from the terrace. A more private uncertainty rose where public anger had been. Geoffrey belonged easily to bright rooms. He enjoyed noise with the turn of 100 faces toward the next amusing thing he might say. Perhaps silence pleased him tonight only because he had spent weeks conquering crowds. Perhaps when there was no scandal to master, and no difficult guest to divert ordinary courtship with, Harriet would feel too small. The thought frightened her more than Edmund's gossip had. Edmund's lie had required only an answer. This required a choice she could not make safe in advance. Geoffrey did nothing to rescue her from the pause. He simply stood there in the dimming room, one hand resting beside the snuffer, waiting without turning her hesitation into a jest. Harriet looked at him and decided that uncertainty was not the same thing as surrender. "If there is a third dance," she said, "literal or otherwise, it cannot belong to this room." Geoffrey's gaze remained on hers. Harriet smiled a little. "I want you to court me through the summer." Something changed in his face, quick and bright. Privately, she added, "Ah, without using me to win arguments. A severe restriction, without announcing anything on my behalf. Cruel. And without assuming that because I enjoy arranging a supper, I therefore wish to arrange every supper until death. That condition may save us both." She laughed softly. Then his expression steadied again. "Then I shall attempt the novel experience of not inviting an audience." Harriet crossed the last few feet between them. She lifted one hand to his jaw. Geoffrey did not reach for her until she had closed the distance herself. The kiss was brief, warm, almost startling in its quietness. When she drew back, his hands rested lightly at her waist. "No witnesses," he murmured. "Do not sound so disappointed. I am thinking of my reputation. You will survive. Your confidence in me is touching." Harriet kissed him once more shorter this time, because she wanted to hear him lose the next remark. He did. An hour later, dawn began to pale above the Devon coast. Harriet and Geoffrey sat side by side on the cold stone steps outside the terrace doors. The ballroom behind them was empty. Her gold gown spread over the step. His cravat had loosened beyond any standard his valet would have approved. Between them stood a small silver platter with 3 lemon pastries rescued from the supper room. Geoffrey took the first and bit into it. He considered with exaggerated gravity. "Cold. It is nearly morning. An explanation, not a defense. You may return it to the kitchen. And insult the cook, never." Harriet took the second pastry. The crust cracked softly between her fingers. Lemon and sugar cut through the chill of the sea air. For several minutes they ate without speaking. There would be callers and letters later. Some people would still prefer Edmund's version, because scandal is more entertaining than correction. None of it required them to turn this dawn into another public answer. The honorarium remained Harriet's witnessed and recorded separately from any courtship. The scandal had already failed to drive her from the rooms she chose to enter. One pastry remained. Harriet looked at it. Once she would have offered it before deciding whether she wanted it, making herself useful before anyone could decide she was not needed. Geoffrey reached for nothing. Harriet noticed her own small hunger. She noticed, too, that she wanted to give him the last pastry, simply because the choice pleased her. She picked it up and held it out. For you. His brows rose. Voluntarily. Do not make me reconsider. He accepted it. No toast, no declaration, no audience. He simply ate the last pastry. Harriet leaned her shoulder lightly against his. Behind them, the ballroom stayed empty. Ahead, the sea turned silver with morning. And for once, Harriet did not wonder what anyone else in the house required of her. The end.